me. I am, as most of you know, not a specialist on Indian affairs, although I do keep some contact with it. And certainly I found this book to be a wonderful education. I must say I agree with everything that Professor Jayal brought up. In fact, I was wondering first what kind of book is this going to be? And I mean, you know, is it going to be, as you say, a thematically developed thing? Is it going to be a particular, a specialized study? And so I was actually quite delighted that this would work very well as, let me qualify, it worked very well as a very advanced graduate text. For instance, it covers all these topics, as you heard, and it covers all the up-to-date arguments and debates about these topics. And so you get a very comprehensive sort of statement of what the issues are here. In fact, it goes into considerable detail about particularly the economic chapters in the beginning, about the debates in the realm of growth and distribution and those issues. And some of it gets a little technical if you're not an economist, but it is very useful to have. And I would say that it's like going through a Mahabharata through the hand-to-hand combat. You know, that's what they do. They sort of cover it at that level of detail, and so it can be. You know, if it's something you have to digest, you better be a big python, because you know it's a large meal, and for that it's very rewarding. You learn a lot, and very nicely what they do at the end of this is not in all the chapters. I suspect each author has his own version style. But at the end of a particularly complex set of debates, they provide their own take on it, which is usually a very balanced take, right? I mean, there is, you know, this is good for this, but this is a little, you know, bit much not acceptable, and this is what we have our own view on it. And so, from that perspective, you can come out feeling quite educated and enlightened. So that's it's a remarkably useful work, especially if you're a teacher of Indian studies, Indian political economy. Now, a little bit about their attitude and approach. I was a little bit surprised to hear Professor Harris present his rather dismal view of the Indian situation, because I don't think that you get, or not of the Indian situation, let me say in particular of the major political actors in India, of which the state, of course, is primary. And because I thought that the analysis itself, particularly through the modality through which I just described, it presents this kind of balance, and it sort of also talks considerably about, you know, the kinds of policies, state policies and so on, that have had some effect on the ground. I think it's a little too much to say success, but that have been able to deliver some things, and so on. So there is that in the book, I think, more than you might expect. But of course there is also, I mean, what he said is also reflects not just the book, but the reality on the ground about the weakness of many of the Indian, certainly, institutions of delivery. Now, I just wanted to isolate a few themes which they take up. There are many themes there. and we were in fact asked to sort of pick on certain areas of particular interest. And so I picked on three themes. The first is the issue of civil society, and here this is in several chapters, in several different chapters, but more particularly in one or two, which I have not worked very closely to mark out which chapters precisely. But fundamentally, it's around, I think, and I think very appropriately, around the issue brought up by Professor Partha Chatterjee on civil society and political society. And this is, for those of you, this has already been discussed. For those of you who are not familiar with this distinction, it is that civil society is something that comes out from the Western tradition, and Hegel's philosophy is invoked to understand it, and it generally refers to the sphere of middle class associational activity of a modern political system, which leaves out, of course, the bulk of the population, which is not middle class and associational in the same way, and does not and is not necessarily urban, and they use much more the existing political system, which with very high transaction costs and politicians and so on. And here they produce a lot of details about discussions of pradhans in slums and so on, which is very useful about how these are the agencies through which the poor manage to get some resources and some things to which they have been entitled in their societies, particularly for their social needs and so on. I think that this is one that is a very interesting issue, and I would say that the whole civil society, political society, incidentally, the main question that I have at the end of this, particularly not being an Indian specialist, an India specialist, is, I mean, how much does this book reflect and lead us to think about the position of India, that is the status of India in global scholarship of what's happening, or in global politics and global society and globalization. I mean, to what extent do these trends and institutional effects reveal larger global forces? And clearly, the three issues that I'm taking up, but perhaps all of these issues, are in fact particularized expressions of things that are happening over the last 20 years all over the world. In particular, of course, I see perhaps most contrasting, in some ways contrastingly, but also addressing very similar issues in China. The three issues that I talk about, the emergence of an urban middle-class associational sphere, which is called civil society in the Indian context, also emerges in China, with also the kind of divisions. I mean, you have rural activists and migrant labor in China and so on, who do not have access to this kind of middle-class association. But even more, I think, in other parts of Asian societies and Latin America and so on, and perhaps increasingly in Africa, you're beginning to see the same kind of tensions. So there's that issue of civil society and political society. The second issue that I think also has considerable resonances elsewhere is this whole question of governance. Governance, particularly in the moment of what we have called the post-neoliberal state, right? We don't really know how to think about it, but they're going beyond neoliberalism in many important, well, they're not necessarily going beyond, but they are, perhaps they even, you know, in the Latin American context, this is called, what is it called? Neo-structuralism, where they talk about it essentially as really reacting to the differentiations, to the stratifications, to the negative effects of neoliberal globalization. And so you had this whole, from the 2000s, you had, you know, all of these Latin American governments that were much more the kind of new socialist types of people like Chavez and so on. And to some extent, I think India and China are also reacting very much to this kinds of effects of neoliberalism. But to what extent does it change the technologies of redistribution? To what extent does it change the modalities of redistribution? To what extent does it deal with questions of governance in ways that we had understood it earlier, before the neoliberal moment, is of course something that is still questionable, and something that can come, I think, we can gain an understanding of it through this kind of comparative situation. So I think that's something that is very interesting. And here, both our speakers before me have talked to some extent about this new state sort of model. And I think this is something that the book hints at, but does not develop sufficiently. Professor Jayal brought up the idea of the new kind of technocratic administrator in the IS. I think this is a very important issue. The whole question of expertise now dominates government in a way that it never did before. And it's actually very interesting to try and think of whether this model of expertise, which also incidentally seeks to keep out lots of civil society, NGO organizations, who incidentally I think do straddle much more the political society, civil society than we would believe. And this is something that the book also does speak to. I mean, the ways in which the differentiation, the strict differentiation of civil society and political society is actually in reality bridged in many different kinds of ways. Though, of course, you know, there are these divisions remain, and it's very interesting to see both whether we go more with Professor Jayal's idea that someone like Anna Hazare and so on, because he's not progressive in a leftist sense of the word, is in fact that's separated from rural aspirations, and whether in fact they don't present a certain type of conservative bridge, quite possibly, which is, you know, depends on your politics there, right? So, so there are different kinds of bridges that are sort of emerging, and I've lost my train of thought, but it's okay. I'll finish off soon. So first was political society, civil society, and governance. And no, the question I was thinking of is that with this new kind of technocratic expertise, and particularly the usage of technology and the usage of public-private partnerships, all of this new apparatus, while throwing money, you know, both in 2005, India started the Narega scheme, which I see very much as a post-neoliberal thing, and China just absolved all agricultural taxes and created all these new instruments for private-public partnership, in a sense, you know. So all these new technologies of intervention and so on, does political society then work in an interesting way with this technocratic government? You know, and how does it work? And how does it mediate that? It becomes a three-way relationship in some ways. Now, and the final thing that I think this book does very well is really point to the manner in which, though I think there's a contradictory dimension, especially as I was listening to Professor John Harris in this question, is the rural question, which is of great interest to me. The rural, am I going on too long?
I think
yeah. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. The rural question, it seems to me, is presented very lucidly by them at the first level, which is that they almost suggest that the rural problem is certainly not the type of problem that there was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. It has moved from being a purely agricultural problem to becoming a problem, which we know very well in neoliberal societies, of one of the new enclosure movements, right? Particularly in the forest realm, where in fact forest peoples, forest communities are losing their resources because of mineral, because of the new nature of capital and its movement into these types of earlier, less valuable resource bases and so on, that are now, or land grab for real estate developers and so on, with this growing urbanization and things like that. So you're getting a new type of contradiction. But today what I think I heard from John is much more how the rural situation it has not been touched and nothing is happening there. But I think there's a complexity here. I mean, on the one hand, we find that there is actually much less of, some source here suggests that there's much less labor involved in agriculture per se. They may be in the rural sector, but it's much less. So in other words, it's in the informal economy. And of course, we don't have a proper understanding for obvious or self-evident reasons of how to understand the informal economy and informal society. I mean, where does it stand in relation to everything else? It seems to me is something that also has to be explored here. So anyway, I'm going to just close here without any ceremonial conclusion or trying to produce some kind of symmetry and order and move on because my time is over.